OK, we're also going to be joined a little bit later by Ben Toomey, the Chief Executive of Generation Rent UK, as we're going to be asking now if it's too easy for landlords to kick out renters. Now, Ben will also have some advice for you if you're currently struggling with a landlord or you need some advice on your renting situation. So any questions that you might have, 0207 862 2222 is the number, and we'll speak to you in just a moment. Now, 5 years ago, former Prime Minister Theresa May promised to scrap the so-called no-fault evictions that allow landlords to evict their tenants with just 2 months' notice and no requirement to provide a reason for doing so. Campaigners like Ben from Generation Rent say that this has led to a rise in homelessness and that the government is betraying renters. Now, the latest figures show that the private rental costs in the UK have risen by 9.2% in the last year alone, and that first-time buyers are facing the toughest conditions in 70 years to get on the property ladder. Ben, I'm going to come to you in a moment, but I'm going to start with you, Mike, as a landlord.
Yeah.
How do you feel about Section 21 or the no-fault evictions?
Well, look, I think private landlords sometimes get a hard time in this country, right? I've been a property investor now for 10 or 20 years. My family are into property. And I can tell you, we have landlords associations. We demand the very highest standards of care and keeping the apartments up to date. Now, you might say the 2 month no-fault tenancy agreement to be terminated, but sometimes if a couple have taken out a rental, they haven't told you they've got a child, and the child's been running around the flat with cranes and destroying all the walls and all that kind of stuff.
You can wash that off, mate.
You try it. You try it.
I have a child that runs around painting the walls pink.
Yeah, but they're not washing it off, are they? And it goes on for weeks or months and all that. And then you find that, they've been taking liberties like storing the bike in the hallway and all the oil's dropped onto the carpet. It can happen, and you do have to go up against it. However, I'm very sympathetic to people who live in poor housing. And when I see these stories on local television of social housing, which is disgusting, with mould on the walls and water, I always say, no private landlord will allow it to happen. So I think private landlords, generally speaking, provide a good service and provide millions of homes in this country. Don't make it more difficult for them.
OK, well, we'll see what Ben Toomey thinks from Generation Rent UK. Ben, you join us now. Thank you very much. What's your thoughts? Is it too easy for landlords to be able to kick renters out of their property?
It's far too easy at the moment. There's only 2 months' notice needed in England with no reason given to ask someone to leave their home. So they don't have to have done anything wrong as a renter. We can have that notice as renters. We're constantly living in fear of that happening. We struggle to put down roots in our communities because of it. And the very worst side of it is that people live in fear of raising complaints to their landlords when things are going wrong. So the mould and damp that Mike just mentioned, that's really important that we raise that and we talk to our landlord about how we can resolve those problems. But about 1 in 5 renters avoid making complaints because they fear being evicted, because they know how easy that is. And actually, almost half of renters that have complained about conditions report receiving a Section 21 eviction notice within 6 months. So these fears aren't unfounded. I think it's interesting that Mike uses the example of a child, because having 2 months in order to be evicted and find a new home, that's one of the leading causes of homelessness. And we have a record number of children living in temporary accommodation right now. Clearly something has to give there. Just to address quickly the point on mould and damp as well, in social housing, yes, it can be awful, and wherever it exists, it can be really harmful to your health. Private renters experience mould and damp more frequently than people living in social housing, and when we do experience it, it's more likely to cause us the most serious harm as well. So it's not just happy days in private renting, it's something that's really a big struggle, and Section 21 evictions make that more of a problem because we can't actually raise problems with our landlord.
I had no idea. It does feel a little bit like council, if you're renting through the council, that you have more protections in terms of where you live. But if you're a private renter, you're kind of out on your own, Michael.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have damp in our private rental property.
Really?
And my housemate asked the landlord for a dehumidifier, and he said no, because then I'd be admitting that the house has damp. Because they always try and blame it on you. They say you're not opening the window enough.
Okay.
Whereas but there's very specific mould coming in, actually behind a sort of built-in wardrobe, if anyone knows how to fix that.
Yeah.
I think the key issue here as well, and it is interesting you've sort of raised the example with children, because it's quite new actually in this country that you've got lots of people raising kids in the private rental sector, because it used to be the case that either you'd be you'd get on the property ladder or you'd live in a council home. Because we've got a massive shortage of council homes, we need to build shed loads more. And because it's very, very difficult to get on the property ladder, you've got lots of parents raising their kids in a private home. Now, if you imagine as a parent of kids that you don't know if you're going to be in that property in 2 months' time. You might move out of the catchment area of the kid, of the school your kid is planning to go to. Suddenly you've got to get a new GP. It's completely impossible, I think, to raise a family. Well, it's not impossible because people are doing it, but it's very, very
uncertain.
It's a terrible way to have to raise children. And I think the idea that a landlord should be able to, have the freedom to kick someone out because they need that. I think we're getting our priorities wrong.
It's not kicking people out.
Well, it is.
It's not, honestly. There are good and bad landlords, but I think the majority of them are good because I mix with them. We have landlords associations, and we do insist on very high standards of keeping the accommodation up to date. Just a couple of months ago, I paid £6,000 for a new shower bathroom after I detected a leak which was causing damp, and we cleared it all out and rebuilt it into there. But what I'd say is that sometimes, remember, we don't get the rent paid for 3 or 4 months, and we say, all right, I'm sorry you're struggling, I'll try and help you out and all that, and then it doesn't, and whoosh, they're off in the middle of the night.
But Mike, wouldn't not getting your rent paid be a reason to evict someone? That would be, you don't need a no-fault.
But you try to be compassionate about it. That's what I'm saying. You say, OK, sorry, one of the partners lost their job, OK,
sorry,
well,
but what I'm trying to say,
yeah.
Mike, as a landlord, you would have a reason then to evict your tenant. You don't need a no-fault eviction clause. You don't need Section 21 because you have enough protections that say if your tenant doesn't pay, and I think it is something like 3 months. I don't think it's just 1 month and you can kick them out.
No faults can happen for a number of reasons. For instance, with the mortgage rates going up, OK, landlords who bought their
struggling to pay the mortgage.
And they just have to say, look, I'm sorry, I can't afford the service charges and the mortgage anymore. I've got to ask you to leave. I've got to sell up. That can be a reason.
I was kicked out on a Section 21 purely because the landlord needed to come back into the flat, and I did have some sympathy for that.
Well, I think that the strange sort of strategy you're using here in terms of argumentation is you're saying most landlords are good, so we don't need regulation. But the whole point of regulation is to police the bad landlords. Because as a renter at the moment, you are very much at the whim of your landlord. Now, they might be terrible people, they might be good people, but you don't get to choose. And the whole point of introducing legislation is if you've got a terrible landlord, you have some rights so that you can have an argument with them. Whereas at the moment, if you've got a terrible landlord and you try and have an argument with them, they can say, OK, you're out.
But I would also like to focus, and Mr. Toomey mentioned it, on the social housing crisis in this country, because we see these terrible problems, this terrible level of social housing. The government should spend more time on trying to get that right, not penalising landlords who are providing good accommodation.
But what Ben also said was there's more mould and things in the private sector. I want to get to that call. James from Oldham, you've got an ongoing issue with your landlord at the moment?
Yes, I've literally just had a £200 increase on my rent, and it's almost kind of like I'm trying to be pushed out.
Okay, so you think why would you think the landlord is trying to push you out when he or she already has a Section 21 that says that they could give you a 2 months notice and you'd have to be out anyway?
It's easier to apply financial pressure than it is for at least with a Section 21. You can argue that you can go back and forth, but when it comes to financial pressure, it's more difficult to argue.
Okay, interesting. I'm just going to send your query to Ben. I feel like you'd be the expert on this. Have you got any advice for James?
Thank you. Yes, James, I don't know how far into this process you are. I'm really sorry to hear about it, but often the best thing to do if you've just received this rent rise is to take some time, think about what it means, and then realise that you may be in a better negotiating position than you think. If they don't want you to move out, then the threat of moving out, because that will incur some costs to the landlord, having to bring someone else in, that might be the best thing to do, is say that, I've looked around the area, I've seen what the average rent rise is, or the average rent price around here is, and then you can potentially negotiate what that would look like. If that doesn't work and it's an unreasonable increase, it's above what they'd be charging in the area generally, then you can go to what's called the first tier tribunal. It's worth looking up in England. It's little known, but they can actually come to a judgment about whether that is a reasonable increase. What that doesn't protect you from, I suppose, is the evictions that we're talking about at the moment, the Section 21 evictions, because they can still be slapped on at any moment. So I'm really sorry to say, but your rights under the current system, there is a law going through Parliament hoping to change this, but your rights under the current system mean that an eviction could still come. So it's probably worth preparing for moving out and thinking about where you might be able to go. But in the meantime, don't assume that you're definitely being kicked out at this stage, because there's still the ability to negotiate on the rent.
James, I was hoping Ben might have better news for you. Have you tried any of the things that Ben suggested there already?
No, that's given me quite a bit of information, and like you said, I didn't know about that tribunal service.
James, can I just say to you, it's very unusual for a rise of £200 in your... Is that monthly?
Yes, monthly.
You see, 5% is usually about the most acceptable rise you can push through within the law and within the regulations that Ben's talking about. So,
and I'm sure a lot of people are facing this with interest rates as well. Landlords passing that on to renters.
Basically, the landlord said, "Oh, my mortgage rates have gone too high."
I think a lot of people might be facing that, James. I'm going to have to wrap this up, but, I'm sure a lot of people are facing very similar sort of things. And actually, I looked it up. When you look at the average rent and the average income people are earning, they're spending more than 50% of their wage on their rent. So it's just a very, very difficult time out there if you are a private renter or maybe a council renter too. James, thank you for your call.